Hi, this is Carl from Linguagenesis, and what I want to talk about in this video are the differences which exist between using the two Spanish verb infinitives saber and conocer, each of which translates into English as to know. Now, if you're someone who has previously studied Spanish or is in the process of studying Spanish, and you have a teacher who is very much into the grammar of the language, then you've probably already touched upon saber and conocer, in addition to the slight differences in usage between other word pairings, amongst them por and para, ser and estar, and que and cual. Now, I've already released videos discussing the differences between some of those word pairings, although I'm now beginning to think that it may be necessary to do a few re-recordings in order to simplify those explanations which I gave previously and make them slightly easier to follow by language learners or potential modern foreign language learners. Now, amongst those word pairings which I've just mentioned, I think that saber and conocer is the easiest one to get to grips with. Obviously, rules exist for when to use saber and rules exist for when to use conocer, but my advice would be this: provided that the rules are worded as accurately as possible, then take into consideration the ones which apply to conocer before you actually refer to the ones which apply to saber, because as some of my own students have already tried to argue with me, they see borderline cases as regards when you should be using one as opposed to the other, and that misunderstanding or confusion has arisen as a result of them having gone to the saber rules first instead of the conocer rules. So my advice would be, once you've got the rules worded accurately, and I'm going to give you those accurate rules, is to give consideration first and foremost to the ones which apply to conocer. So what are the rules of using conocer? Conocer means to know a person and to know a place. Also, it can mean to know something in depth, to be familiar with a subject area with which only a minority of individuals would know a lot about. To know a person implies that you're acquainted with that person, that you've met that particular individual. And similarly, to know a place would imply that you've been to the town, city, country or region in question, that you've visited it. But notice the slight difference in meaning between to know a person and to know of a person. In the second instance, we would be required to use saber, because now it's not necessarily indicating that we're acquainted with that person. It simply points out that we know facts about the individual in question. And so, because it's to do with facts, we're now entering into saber territory. Likewise with conocer, there's a slight difference in meaning between to know a person, which requires using a conjugated form of that verb, and to know of a place. To know a place would imply that you've been there, as I've already mentioned, but to know of a place would indicate that somebody has perhaps told you about their experiences in a particular country, that they visited that country, but that you've not done so yourself. You've merely found out about the country, or you've done some research into that country, maybe before you've actually gone and visited it. On the topic of to know something in depth, as I mentioned, a subject area with which only a minority would be familiar, it could be a case of knowing the history of 17th century Spain, being very familiar with the works of Picasso, or knowing the plays of Shakespeare back to front, and so forth. Anything with which not a majority of people would be familiar. Now going to saber. Saber is used for mere facts. whether it's general knowledge, knowing facts about places, knowing facts about people, to know that red and yellow makes orange, to know that 10 times 12 is 120, and so forth. And its extra and third use is to know how to do something, as in to know how to drive a car, to know how to cook, although usually, and especially in mainland Spain, the translation of how would not be included. So to give in the target language, I know how to drive, the literal translation would be I know to drive. Likewise, my husband knows how to cook very well would be given literally from Spanish into English as my husband knows to cook very well. So I hope that's clarified as far as possible the differences between saber and conocer. As I mentioned, I've tried to give the rules and word the rules as accurately as possible, but what's important to bear in mind is that we look at the conocer rules first, because you may lead yourself into the belief that there are borderline cases if indeed you look at the saber rules first. As I say, look at the conocer rules, and then if you find that the example you're attempting to translate, whether it be into Spanish or back into English, doesn't come under any of the conocer rules, then you can assume that it will be using a form of saber. But once again, do check under the rules. So I hope that's clarified the grammar point a little bit better.